Hello, MrShine here from HearthstonePlayers.com, bringing you another video from my Arena Quiz series. Today we get to know our friendly neighborhood tree hugger Malfurion a little bit better, as we choose Druid for this week's Arena Quiz. As with my last video, I'm going to assume everyone on the internet has watched/loved an Arena Quiz video or two, so I'll skip the rules, but if by some miracle you've been living under a rock and haven't heard about these videos, you can check the description below for how you're supposed to take the quiz. Before the quiz though, let's take a closer look at this nature-loving hero. Druid is all about flexibility, with a variety of choose one cards that give you two choices for what you want the card to do. This falls in line with the Druid's hero ability, which is also quite flexible and is one of the stronger powers in the arena since it lets you ping a minion or give yourself a little bit of health. Another strength is the variety of late game fatties the Druid has at his disposal. Ironbark Protector is a bruiser at 8 mana. If your game goes long, it's more likely the Druid will have the better late game minions, so oftentimes it's the right idea to play Druid as a control class in the arena. Druids also have a fantastic set of mid-game minions. Keeper of the Grove and Druid of the Claw are awesome cards that act like a Swiss Army knife for your deck. They can give you damage or can help silence a pesky threat, or plop down a 4/6 taunt. And don't forget Swipe, an utterly amazing removal card that can go face or clear one big minion and a few little ones. And don't get me started on spell power boosted Swipe. A nuke plus a Consecrate? Yes please. However, Druid also has a few weaknesses. The first is they lack hard removal. Okay, technically they have Naturalize, but that card is really bad. So outside of Swipe, Wrath, and the occasional Starfire, the Druid will need to get by with their hefty minions to clear dangerous threats. Another downside is some of the best Druid cards in Constructed, Ancient of War, Ancient of Lore, and Force of Nature, are epic level cards and therefore will rarely be seen in your deck. This means if you're used to Druid and Constructed, you might not be familiar with how it plays out in the arena. So now that you know a little bit more about Druid, let's move on to the quiz, keeping our eye on high priority Druid cards like Swipe, Wrath, Druid of the Claw, and Ironbark Protector. This pick was straightforward because only one card is not terrible, and that's Defender of Argus. A poor statted minion as a standalone, but if you have minions out on turn 4, it acts like a Yeti that gives taunts with the additional +2/+2. It's also a utility card later in the game to protect yourself from big threats. Pint-Sized Summoner is a 2/2 for 2, which is bad in general, and the ability often won't come into effect unless you are planning on it surviving during the mulligan stage and built your curve around it. Angry Chicken? Someday I'll draft you, but today will not be that day. Dark Iron Dwarf is a great flexible turn 4 play that can help a cheaper minion or a token trade up for a card. A 4/4 for 4 isn't that shabby either. Stormwind Champion comes next since his ability is very strong in the late game, but Druid tends to have a lot of late game options in their draft, so I didn't think it was needed quite yet. Dalaran Mage has poor stats since one attack will very rarely kill anything outright, since most minions played in the arena have at least 2 HP. Darkscale Healer and Gurubashi Berserker are both somewhat uninspiring 5-drops, but the Healer has more upside with a battle cry and less downside since 2 attack is very vulnerable to a variety of answers in the arena. Druid has no way to self-ping his own minions, so Gurubashi will likely start off a bit slow. Shieldbearer has no attack. How are we supposed to get card advantage from something that can't attack? No thank you. None of these are too fantastic, but I'll go with the Assassin since the 7 stealth damage can help finish off a game or take down another huge threat. I'm not too happy with it, but the alternatives are just as crummy. Bite is worse removal than Swipe in almost all instances. It doesn't have the 1 damage AoE, it can't be boosted by spell power, it's blocked by taunts, and even though you gain 4 armor for using it, you still need to use your face on the minion you're clearing, so you'll still take face damage if you're clearing something huge. Quite simply, it's not the removal spell you want to be playing in your deck. And if Bite is bad, what does that make Savagery? Unless I fill my deck with Bites, Savagery will usually only deal 1 damage for 1 mana, and that's after you spend 2 mana for the hero ability. In its current nerfed state, it's one of the worst cards in the game. Ancient Brewmaster has pretty good stats as a 4-drop, and it's almost always going to be able to trade with another 4-drop. Its Battlecry is a double-edged sword though, since you can lose tempo on turn 4 if you have to bring one of your minions back into your hand. On the other hand, it can be huge if you can bounce back a useful Battlecry in the late game. In either case, it's fairly easy to play around the Battlecry, and on an empty board you're happy to drop the Brewbear. Soul of the Force is a situational win more card, since if you're ever in a position where you can give Death Rattle to 3 or more of your creatures, you're likely in a winning position anyways, but it still has its uses and can give you a lot of value when played at the right time. Mark of Nature is an expensive buff that doesn't really give you a whole lot. It gives you 4 damage or 4 health and taunt for 3 mana. I know this buff is a little better than that since you get to choose which creature gets the buff, but my point is the 3 mana is a lot for the not so great return. This pick has a single correct pick, and that pick is Savage Roar. Not because Savage Roar is that good, but rather the alternatives are awful. Shield Bearer usually throws a card into the wind, and we have no weapons to make Dread Corsair less expensive, so it's an overcosted 4-drop. Savage Roar isn't awful though, since it can turn a good board position into a win condition with massive damage, or it can give your cheap minions a chance to trade up. The saving grace of this card is the fact it gives your hero 2 attack as well, so at the very least you can help clear something with your hero, while also giving a buff to your minions. We only have 1 spell at this time, but even so Violet Teacher is still a respectable 4-drop since it offers upside to the already decent stats. Questing Adventurer is not a card you want to play on turn 3 because the stats are bad, but it does have potential if you can combo it in the mid to late game since it presents a priority target for your opponents to deal with. Still a low priority card because it's often a gamble and when it flops your opponent can easily clear it. And Angry Chicken, we meet again. I hope we shan't meet a 3rd time. Now that's what I'm talking about. Druid of the Claw is one of the best 5-drops in the game. Both a 4/6 Taunt and a 4/4 Charge are great cards, and the ability to choose between the 2 of them with 1 card is icing on the cake. Youthful Brewmaster comes in next as a trusty 3/2 for 2, but we already have 1 Brewmaster so far, and really the key here is it's not as good as Druid of the Claw. Healing Touch heals 8 HP for 3 mana, but it doesn't impact the board. If you're behind on the board and you heal 8, you just delay for a turn while you also give up a card. It's like Frost Nova for Mage, only with less synergy potential in your deck. This one is a preference pick since both of the 3-drops are average to below average. The Wolf Rider is 3 damage on demand, which rarely survives when played, but you can at least dictate where it goes. The Flesh-Eating Ghoul is weak when played on a board where no trades are made, but if given the chance of a turn and some trades, it can get a lot of attack and can sometimes trade up or put a lot of hurt on the enemy. I went with Wolf Rider though because I think it's more consistent, but both do have their merits, so I didn't dock anyone if you chose one over the other. Young Dragonhawk on the other hand is straight up bad, since its Wind Fury doesn't change the fact it's a 1/1 minion that is not worth a card slot in your deck. Another pick with poor cards, a trend I'm noticing with this draft so far. I see reasoning behind all picks, so I'll walk through them. Mana Wraith has bad stats, although sometimes you can put your opponent in an awkward position with the ability. Still, the hope is you can trade for another 3/2 minion and maybe help set your opponent back a bit. Bite is bad like I said before, but considering the alternatives, it isn't awful here. Light Warden is normally terrible, and it still is pretty awful, but since I'm a hero that can ping with my hero ability, it gets some additional merit since I can finish off a minion that it may have damaged. I did pick Mana Wraith though, but all I can say about this pick is yuck. Everyone's favorite late game Druid minion has shown up to the party, and its pick is obvious, especially when you consider the bad picks that surround it. An 8/8 for 8 is hefty, but the fact it has Taunt makes it that much better, since the hope is the opponent has to ram a variety of minions into it if they want to get through. The downside is you spend the majority of your turn casting the Protector in the late game, and if the opponent has appropriate removal, you're probably in a bit of a pickle. Still, it's the choice, since Priestess of Elune has very bad stats for the mana cost, as does the Raid Leader. Harvest Golem is one of the best 3-drops you can get. Its Death Rattle is extremely difficult for others to deal with, and if it can hold its own against most other 3-drops, it can be a terror for the opponent's 2-drops. Worst, if it gets a chance to kill something and survive without triggering its Death Rattle, the opponent is going to be in for a long game. Remember when I talked about how Bite was bad? Claw, by comparison, is pretty good, since 2 damage for 1 mana is way better than 4 damage for 4 mana. Still, it's not as valuable as a Harvest Golem here. And finally, Elven Archer has a useful battle cry, but the poor 1/1 body that follows up the battle cry is very bad, so it's not often worth picking, especially for a hero that already has a 1 damage hero ability on demand. Oh good grief, the pain train of bad picks doesn't appear to be over. There are no picks I want here, so I'll have to pick between 3 bad options. I went with Mad Scientist, since a 2/2 minion can usually trade with an enemy 3/2 minion in the early game. Druid has no secrets though, so there's no upside to this card. Naturalize is hard removal, but by golly that card draw it gives your opponent is brutal. Even when I kill a big minion with Naturalize, I'm often not happy, since I give the opponent some new answers. And Silverback Patriarch is a crummy taunt minion that costs way too much and hits for way too little. This was an interesting pick, but I went with the Ogre because it's one of the premier 6-drops in the arena. 7 HP is very difficult to deal with efficiently, and the 6 attack is exactly what you want to see on curve. Compared to the Haunted Creeper, it's a pretty good 2-drop, but its stickiness comes at the cost of it not dealing much damage, so I think the solid body of the Ogre is more valuable. Wolf Rider is only average, which isn't enough for us to pick here. A tricky pick, but I ended up going with a Starfire. I don't have much in the way of removal at this point, and Starfire is expensive removal, but it is great when you can afford it since it draws you a card. It's also pretty nice in top deck wars, since it can usually take out a mid-sized threat while giving you another card and 4 mana remaining. Stormpike Commando is next, acting as a poor man's Argent Commander, with a 2 damage battle cry. I actually think the Commando might be better than it is often given credit for. The stats are bad, but 2 damage on command can often come in handy. Both of these are better than the Narrowbar Weblord, which isn't the worst 2-drop, but the 1 attack is a bit underwhelming. At this point I have no early game removal, so the Claw will be quite useful to clear a 3-2 in the early game, and sometimes give me enough mana to follow it up with a threat of my own. Gnomish Inventor comes next, since the card draw is always nice, and a 2-4 body is poor but passable when you consider the battle cry. Stormpike Commando comes in a close third, but the other 2 are more valuable at this point. Not the greatest picks here, and we've already talked about all of them as well. Flesh-Eating Ghoul is the best of the options here, so it's the pick on account of the others being even worse. As mentioned before, the Druid of the Claw is one of the best 5-drops, so it's slightly better than the Silverhand Knight, which isn't great, but doesn't have the same flexibility. Direwolf Alpha has poor stats, but the ability isn't bad, and it does have some use in this deck since it sports some subpar 2-drops, so the additional damage could help those cards trade up. Still, Druid of the Claw is more valuable, but at this point I'll need to be more wary of getting some 2-drops since we're over the halfway mark. Unstable Ghoul isn't the best 2-drop, but when timed well, the Death Rattle can do some damage to the opponent, and besides we're short on 2-drops in the deck. It beats another Mad Scientist, which is a straight 2-2 for our purposes, and War Golem is a big guy, but in Druid, Ironbark Protector is much stronger, and due to our curve it's not worth taking a so-so big card when we have other options. Cobra is the only pick here because the others are simply disgusting. Ancient Mage has awful stats, and besides we don't have any cards in this deck to use the spell power. Savagery is even worse as we mentioned before, so that leaves the average Cobra, which will almost always kill something due to its ability. This deck is not exactly shaping up to be a winner, but maybe the last third will give me some goodies. This one was also very crummy, but I have a little bit of Death Rattle synergy in this deck with Unstable Ghoul, Mad Scientist, and Harvest Golem. Since the other cards are bad, it's actually not crazy to pick the Undertaker, which is what I did, since I need some early game anyways. I talked about Soul of the Forest and Mark of Nature before, since they're both cards that need the board to be acceptable, and it doesn't look like my early game is that hot, so it's hard to say how many opportunities I'll get to utilize those anyways. A tough choice between an okay 2-drop and a strong late game minion. I opted to go with the Bloodsail Raider because I need to ensure I have playable early drops in this deck before I run out of chances. Having said that, the Stormwind Champion is great since it can shift games with the awesome ability, and if I was feeling more confident about my early game, I'd absolutely snap it up. Gurubashi Berserker is the loser here since it's slow to start rolling. I already have some solid 5-drops, and I don't have any ways to self-trigger it like the Mage does. Another Brewmaster isn't exactly what I want to see, but compared to the rest of the picks in this set, I'm forced into it. The Voodoo Doctor's battle cry is alright, but it's the 1 HP that makes it bad, same with the Dragonhawk as we talked about before. The poor picks continue, and I'm forced into picking a questing adventurer and hope I get a chance to build it up during the game. Young Priestess has 1 HP, so it's easy hero ping fodder, and Mana Addict is always a 1/3 when it's your opponent's turn, so it's easy to kill without trading a card. Plus, we all have very few spells in this deck anyways, so it's unlikely I'll be able to get good burst from the card. Dark Iron is the only good card here, and we talked about what makes it good earlier, so it doesn't need much discussion. Poison Seeds is an interesting card though, new from the Naxx expansion, and not one I've used much in the arena. Unless you run a lot of tokens or are afraid your opponent will play a bunch of huge minions, it's rarely going to swing a game in your favor, and the opponent will be the ones who have a turn to respond to your play, so it can backfire if the board is relatively even. I already talked about the Patriarch being bad, so we can skip it other than saying it's really, really bad. Oh my, hopefully no one picked anything but the Stormwind Knight here. It's a respectable 4-drop that has flexibility with the charge, and the other cards are simply awful. Elven Archer is already bad as a 1/1 with 1 damage. Moonfire skips the minion in exchange for costing 0 mana, but don't be fooled, it's still nearly useless. As for the Murloc and its 1 HP, ew. With my wimpy early game minions, one thing that I can do is to salvage them and turn them into new cards using the Cult Master. I have little card draw anyways in this deck, so it seems like I could gain some value here. Spiteful Smith is also fine, but I already have a few Druids of the Claw which are objectively better in the Druid deck. Dalaran Mage only has Starfire to buff with the spell power, otherwise the stats for 3 mana minion are very underwhelming. This one was tough, so I give a freebie to those who picked Shattered Sun Cleric or Fairy Dragon. Ultimately I opted for a solid 2-drop as being more valuable since I wasn't certain my early game would be able to survive long enough to get value from a Cleric buff. Still, if I had an Unstable Ghoul or the Bloodstale Raider on turn 2, a Cleric buff could help give some value, since they would turn into 4 HP minions and might survive a trade. So there are possibilities for this card in the deck. One Cult Master is enough though, since I have better early game drop options here, but if the other 2 cards were worse, I definitely would have been forced into the Master. Barf. I took the Gnome as another Undertaker buff card, but Raid Leader as a potential buff to some of my 2-drop 2/2s wasn't terrible either. Even Corsair compared to these other losers isn't complete garbage, but I have plenty of 4-drops that are better right now. I was not happy to get any of these picks, so maybe my last pick will help turn things around. I already have one, but the Defender of Argus can hopefully give my other cards a boost for trades. The other cards have already been discussed, and while the Emperor Cobra is passable, I think the Defender has better upside to give me some value if I can get a few minions on the board. There's the last pick, so let's take a look at this deck and analyze it more closely. Overall, the deck looks pretty weak. I don't have any Swipes or Wraths, 2 of the Druid's best removal cards. I also have a pretty light late game with only 1 Ogre and 1 Ironbark Protector, and my early game isn't too hot either with a variety of less than average 2-drops. The Undertaker was a bit of a gamble with only 4 Death Rattle minions in the deck, and I'm going to need to hope that I can get some cards out early if I want any chance of getting some wins here. My main hope is my mid game. I have a chance to draw cards with my Cult Master, some Defenders of Argus to help give me a few other cards to boot, and a pair of Druids of the Claw to help get some value trades. Hope is not lost, but I think the games will all be an uphill battle. What do you guys think about this draft? Are there choices you would have made differently from me? Do you have higher expectations than I about this deck, or do you think it's going to crash and burn? Be sure to tune in next week when I show how this run ended up, and what were some of the key points of the run. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, be sure to subscribe to Hearthstone Players' YouTube channel, which boasts a wide variety of Hearthstone content. Or take a look at my personal YouTube channel if you want to see different games and formats. As always, I've been MrShine, and I'll see you next time!